This video is going to introduce you to the topic of saints and sainthood in the Middle Ages through the character of Sainte, her reliquary, and her miracle stories. What we're going to do is use this one particular saint and her miracle stories to raise a range of topics related to religion and myth in the Middle Ages for our class. So these are the 5 key topics I would like you to listen for in this video lecture. First, the importance of faith. This is a bit of a play on words because the name Sainte Foi translates in English to Saint Faith from the French. Second, popular hagiography and devotional practices. We're talking about biographies of saints that aren't necessarily passed down as official religious doctrine, but are the product of popular storytelling and also popular belief systems. The miracle stories of Sainte Foi show you something about the beliefs of peasants, albeit in a highly mediated form. Next, pilgrimage. You can think of pilgrimage as a form of religious tourism for our purposes. It's travel to holy sites for spiritual benefits. Relics and reliquaries. A relic is usually, but not always, the remains of a saint, often a particular body part. The reliquary is the container that houses the relic and in which it can be venerated. And finally, intercession, or the intercessory power of saints, and how they can act as go-betweens between a worshiper and God, either by presenting prayers on your behalf, or more importantly, for the purposes of the text at hand, by creating an emotional connection that links the worshiper, saint, and Christ. These topics and a few other keywords are going to be listed on a handout linked here and posted in course spaces to help you study. So, Sainte Foi, or Saint Faith, was not a person who lived during the medieval period, but a young girl who was arrested, tortured, and martyred sometime in the 3rd or 4th century France, possibly under the Roman Emperor Diocletian. We're not entirely sure, and sources vary on this point, but she was probably around 12 or 13 years old when she died. Her passion story, or the story of the suffering that led up to her death, says that she was persecuted because, as a Christian, she was unwilling to make sacrifices to the pagan gods. What you see here in this slide is her reliquary, and that's a subject that we're going to return to a little bit later in this video. Our focus here is not on the saint as she existed in France under Roman rule, but her popular hagiography and veneration in the Middle Ages. So what do I mean specifically by popular hagiography in this context? Well, her biography and the miracle stories as written by Bernard of Angers around the year 1010. The image on the screen is a beautiful manuscript copy of the text you're reading in translation this week. And as you'll discover in the readings, Bernard's narrative unfolds in a particular form. We have first the Passio, the story of faith's suffering. Then we have a letter from Bernard to Fulbert, the Bishop of Chartres. Then finally, we have a series of very amusing miracle stories that Bernard has collected for presentation to the bishop and other readers. He's collected these stories by visiting people who lived near the saint's shrine and interviewing them. This interview process is what makes it a popular hagiography or selection of miracles. This text isn't something that has its roots in official church doctrine, but amongst peasants. These are local stories being told verbally, and Bernard is recording them in a mediated form. So he is changing them, of course, when he writes them down. But the origin of these stories as verbal tales gives them a particular character. As you'll read, Sainte Foi is playful and tricky compared to most other saints. And her stories incorporate things like a well-timed and divinely inspired sneeze. And you can find that particular miracle in section 1.22 of your reading, which is called About a Woman Who Wrongfully Seized a Ring That Another Woman Had Bequeathed to Sainte Foi when she was dying. So I just want to pause and talk a little bit about the letter from Bernard to the bishop because it sets the tone for the rest of the text. The author is spelling out exactly how he wants you to read and understand the miracle stories that follow. The first important point Bernard wants to make is that what he's reporting about the stories is absolutely true. The miracle of Guibert, who had his vision restored after his eyes had been plucked out, is recorded exactly, quote, as I hear it from his lips. Bernard says, I'm sitting here with Guibert, looking at him as I write. And with this kind of statement, he wants to communicate that he's taking an almost journalistic approach. This is a research project to Bernard, not a novel. If you're going to find any failing in this work, he writes, it's going to be in how the story is told, not in the facts. He notes specifically that he isn't by nature a gullible person, and that he's subjected these popular stories to rigorous analysis. The second point the author wants to make is that you must bring your own faith to your reading of these stories. He knows that they're going to be difficult to believe at times. As you'll read, they're full of unlikely events and they're very funny at times. So this combination where Bernard says both this text is the result of factual reporting on my investigation and you must have faith or trust in God as you interpret my text is very powerful rhetorically. It makes doubt very difficult for a person who believes in the concept of miracles in general. He needs to make this case because Bernard is translating peasant stories for a learned clerical audience. So let's look at the context, the place around which all this magic is supposed to have happened. What you're seeing now is the Abbey Church of Sainte in Conques. It didn't look exactly like this in the 11th century because it went through multiple construction phases. But nevertheless, this structure was an important pilgrimage location at the time when Bernard was writing. Pilgrimage was a really important part of the spiritual life of Christians in the Middle Ages, and you could go on this type of trip for a range of reasons. So to gain forgiveness for your sins, for example, to ask for protection, or with the hopes of being granted a miracle of some kind. This abbey church had two main advantages that made it a really hot pilgrimage spot in the Middle Ages. The first is that it was on the way to a famous cathedral, Santiago de Compostela, which is thought to be the burial place of St. James, one of the apostles. The second reason that people would want to visit is that within the abbey church are the relics of Sainte Foy, and these relics were very powerful and could heal people. On the screen you'll see this impressive reliquary, which holds the skull of Sainte Foy inside this bejeweled statue of the saint enthroned. Just like the church that we were just looking at, this is not exactly the form that the reliquary would have taken in the 11th century. It wouldn't have looked quite like this. The basic form of the statue, which is a wooden core covered in gold, was made sometime between the late 9th and early 10th century, possibly with some earlier Roman spolia or leftover building materials. But more gold and jewels and cameos were added right up until the 15th century. This was a process of continual adornment of the reliquary. And you can see, I have a few details here, and the detail in the bottom right corner shows that the statue could also be adorned with fresh flowers. She has these little tube vases in her hands. So why all of this emphasis on gold and jewels? Well, the decoration of reliquaries was ubiquitous in the Middle Ages. In fact, it was almost essential to the process of veneration. Remember that the skull of a powerful child saint is inside this statue, and because this is such an important religious object, it needs to be done visual and material justice. The gold and precious stones communicate the preciousness of the relic that's inside. There's another reason for this luxury. The focus on gold and gems is particularly appropriate in the case of Sainte Foy because she was thought to have had a particular fondness for gold, especially golden rings. This is a theme that surfaces in several of the miracle stories that you'll be reading. This saint demands tribute through the donation of worldly goods to the abbey church, and attempting to keep these items from her is either dangerous to your health or just positively futile. So in some cases, as you'll read, you can try to keep your favorite jewelry away from her, but if she really wants it, she'll get it from you one way or another. The last thing I want to briefly touch on is this concept of intercession, or really, I suppose, the kinds of power that saints were thought to have in this time. It's very clear that the relics and reliquary of Sainte Foy are powerful. Bernard says, quote, "The peasants thought that the statue was really looking at them and answering their prayers with her eyes." And you can see in this detail on the screen just how intense her eyes are. Truthfully, though, Bernard, being an educated clergyman, is not that comfortable with the way that the peasants are interacting with the golden statue. At least, he thinks it needs a little bit of explaining or mediation because there's something pagan about it, and he doesn't know for sure that the bishop he's writing to will accept the kind of veneration given to the statue. He writes in justification, quote, "In fact, there is an established usage, an ancient custom, that people erect a statue of their own saint, of gold or silver or some other metal, in which the head of the saint, or rather important part of the body, is reverently preserved. To learned people, this may seem to be full of superstition, if not unlawful, for it seems as if the rites of the gods of ancient cultures, or rather the rites of demons, are being observed. And I was no less foolish, for I also thought this practice seemed perverse and quite contrary to Christian law. But the Holy and Universal Church accepts this image in either carved or modeled form because it arouses our affective piety in the commemoration of our Lord's Passion. So it's not idolatrous or pagan. The function of this kind of statue is to create an emotional connection between the viewer and Christ. So this goes well beyond the saint herself. She is powerful through God's grace, and she's just an access point for the population to connect with the divine. Bernard says right at the beginning of the text that you'll read, quote, "Miracles happened constantly with the help of Christ omnipotent." So this is how I want you to think about the power of saints, as go-betweens, someone you can pray to or ask the guidance of because they can connect you with Christ, either through prayers on your behalf or by this kind of emotional connection.